Welcome everyone to today's webinar on strengthening global governance for existential threats to humanity. In essence, this seminar is about the very survival of humanity and human civilization going forward, and how we can apply governance mechanisms, things like the global infrastructure and architecture, strategies, policy, legislation, to coordinate, in essence, a strategic approach to prevent and reduce risks for existential threats to humanity. So not a small topic to be sure of. So do take a cup of coffee and sit down and really be prepared for this one. So thank you. First, let me introduce myself as well. By way of background, I'm a medical doctor specialised in public health and held senior roles within the UK government, the World Health Organization, and the Commonwealth, before then taking on my current roles as a strategic advisor for the Interaction Council. I'm also chair of a group on existential threats and risks for all with the World Academy of Art and Science, and I'm hoping they're here with us today, and director of the Platform for Planet, Place and People, as well as part of the Commonwealth Centre for Digital Health. All of these things have helped me in my career journey to take a public health approach in terms of addressing these really serious threats to human existence. But I'd also like to thank all the partnerships and networks that I'm drawing from in that experience as well going forward. And today's presentation gives an overview of all of that. So firstly, in terms of the context, this work is being advanced in partnership with something called the Interaction Council. It's a group of former heads of government, currently chaired by Mr. Bertie Ahern, former Prime Minister of Ireland, and President Obasanjo from Nigeria. And historically, they focused on global security challenges and done a lot of work behind the scenes on non-nuclear proliferation, and also establishing a universal declaration of human responsibilities. Over the last 10 years, they've increasingly focused on some of the kind of more modern challenges that we face today, including the threat of pandemics, as well as the planetary emergency. So over the last year, the Interaction Council has convened a number of meetings, and in particular with One Young World launched a Global Youth Security Council for Existential Threats at their One Young World Summit in Belfast last autumn. Building on that experience, One Young World with the Interaction Council co-chaired a high-level meeting at the House of Lords in London, essentially focusing on how do we strengthen global governance to prevent and reduce risks to human existence. In essence, this meeting brought together a number of high-level partners to discuss how to set up and the process and membership for establishing an intergenerational board or council on to address existential threats and risks. And the plan is to launch this at the next Interaction Council plenary, which will be held later this year. So in terms of the wider context then, so the presentation will take us through the main challenges as well as the solutions for addressing existential threats, with a particular focus on the governance solutions. So today's world, we can see, is very different in terms of thinking about global security. So this is the key challenges that many heads of government and policymakers are concerned about. How do we make the world a safer place? And in yesterday's world, the main focus was on wars and the prevention of wars and conflict. That clearly hasn't gone away, and it is still a major preoccupation. However, there are also the increasing challenges from things like pandemics and the planetary emergency, as well as from emerging technology, including AI. All of these impact human security as well as sustainable development and outcomes. So in terms of the international context on this, this work on existential threats essentially builds on the work on sustainable developments, the Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework, and the continued good work on human security approaches, which is very similar in many respects to a public health approach. In terms of it's very people-centered and community orientated in terms of how we enhance human security. However, the main focus of this presentation is thinking about existential threats from a global security perspective. The UN Future Summit is due to occur this autumn at the UN General Assembly in September, and you can see their agenda from the UN Secretary General is much more focused on the future challenges, including a focus on future generations, for example. So the agenda is very much shifting in this world, and I'd like to say that we need to take a step further and apply strategic foresight or good public health approaches in terms of identifying risks to human security and to address existential threats to humanity. So what are the key existential threats that we face? So this is a summary put together with in partnership with the World Academy of Art and Science, with the group that I chair on existential threats, which we've been discussing over the last year or so. What are these key challenges, and and then also what are the kind of solutions and how we can address these. So I've summarized these under the main clusters for the SDGs, so planet, people, peace, and prosperity. And I'll talk through those a little bit more in terms of the next slides. So this is a table that that collates these key threats and risks with impacts and timescales with a RAG rating to try and give a sense of which are the priority areas that we need to be focused on. And you'll see there's an alarming number of red areas, in particular the planet. Over these next few years, we face increasing risks from runaway tipping points, and I'll talk a little bit more about this because it's an area that is often neglected and seen as a long-term threat, but actually what we do in the next few years is going to be really critical to the survival of humanity and many other species as well. Then we've got people. The main risk here is under future pandemics. We're still recovering in many respects from COVID, and there's risks still of new variants emerging from COVID. However, going forward, in terms of an existential threat, synthetic infections are a real and increasing risk going forward. In essence, COVID was a relatively low fatality event, which had a substantial impact on overall global security. However, if we were faced with a much higher fatality infection, it could have absolutely catastrophic impacts, and we've seen that in the history of humankind. For example, much of the indigenous populations in the Americas were wiped out with measles and influenza, so we know that this can happen. And now with the potential of synthetic infections, that could be accidentally released or weaponized, there are real risks behind that. In terms of peace, the threats here continue to be primarily from nuclear disaster or actual conflict, especially in the Ukraine the sort of Russian conflict, it could just be an explosion on an existing nuclear reactor. So again, something that we need to really keep our mind and kind of governance processes aware of. And then we've got prosperity. So you've probably heard a lot in the news about the dangers of artificial intelligence, and in essence, it's artificial general intelligence that we need to be more concerned about in the future, which is where it can be more autonomous in essence in terms of making decisions and actions that don't have any human controls over those. So this is a real danger going forward, and could emerge in the next 3 to 5 years. There are a lot of discussions already happening on how we strengthen governance mechanisms. Ideally, we need something that's a global mechanism. And then there's other. So this includes other causes, for example, of previous mass extinctions, including volcanoes and asteroids, which could happen anytime. And ideally, we need some sort of plan or preparedness approach to address these. So I'm going to focus the next few slides quickly just to go through the planetary emergency, because that had red all along the lines. And I think it's also the kind of key area where we know less about how we can actually address it. So I think it does actually need more focus. However, I'll also touch upon all of the other areas later in the presentation. So in terms of our planetary emergency, tipping points are essentially where you have a steady state, and then because of feedback loops, that this actually creates a shift of essentially what can create a runaway situation in terms of escalating heat and runaway climate change. And we'll see in a minute how we're already entering many of those tipping points. What we know from geological records is that tipping points have started between 1 to 3 degrees. We're already on the news this morning. The warmest month was in March at 1.68 degrees C. Human civilization has had the luxury of living in a steady state for 800,000 years, of mainly between -1 to +1. So we're really in very unknown territory going forward, with a great deal of uncertainty. One of the key things as well is that this area has been relatively not examined in great detail within the UN reports, partly because it's about risk analysis and there's a lot of uncertainties. However, in the last year or so, this is something that's gaining increasing attention, and realistically, it needs a lot more attention, because we may only have a few years to actually rectify some of these challenges. So this slide summarizes the key tipping points, including the temperature range that they actually emerge at. It's from a recent research paper on this agenda by experts in the field. And what you can see here in the second column is that most of the tipping points actually start to occur from 1 degrees plus. And the occurrence has already been observed for virtually all of these tipping points as well. Worryingly, some of these can create abrupt changes in our weather systems, and the impacts are likely to be really quite serious going forward, whether it's sea level rise or impacts changing weather patterns. It's likely to have serious impacts on food and water security, as well as fires and droughts and so on. So just looking to the longer term picture, most of the discussions on the climate change look at temperatures till the end of this century, and at the moment we're forecast to be about 3 degrees by the end of this century on our current trajectory. Clearly 3 degrees is too much based on what we see in terms of the tipping points. We need to not just control the temperatures from rising, but actually try to actively reduce carbon emissions and increase temperatures if we want to create a stable world. So this chart also, which is in one of the UN reports, gives a longer term trajectory. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty here, but over the next few hundred years, what's concerning is the sort of red area, which shows that temperatures could keep going up, especially I think if tipping points really escalate, and forecasts sort of range up to sort of 3 to 10, 12 degrees plus. And it could take a long time for this to come down as part of a geological pattern. Ultimately, we need to take this very seriously, this graph very seriously, and also to ensure that we don't reach anywhere near these thresholds or enter them because of the tipping points occurring. So this next slide then addresses whether we are actually at the edge of a sixth mass extinction. So a lot of people, especially Extinction Rebellion, are kind of really pushing this agenda. And it is a real concern. If you actually look at the 5 mass extinctions that have happened on our Earth, they've occurred mostly from volcanic or asteroid causes. We're currently emitting CO2 emissions equivalent to Mount St. Helens explosion every 2.5 hours. So we're creating our own volcanic equivalent mass extinction. And when we actually look at what's actually happening to different species, the particular concern is something called the Permian extinction, which was framed as the big dying, as it killed the majority of marine and land species, including most of the trees, planets, insects, and microbes. Clearly not a situation that humans could live in, as well as the rest of the biosphere. So what do the different degrees mean? So this is collated again from UN reports as well as other literature. And it basically outlines what are the kind of key consequences at the different degrees Celsius. We're sort of heading towards 2 degrees, where we can expect to see the disappearance of Arctic sea ice and widespread droughts. Whilst in 3 degrees, i.e. what we are expecting towards the end of the century, we're looking at global food crisis and the Amazon rainforest collapse. At 4 degrees, it really becomes uninhabitable for China and India in large part. You would see massive migrations by the end of this century, if not beforehand, as well as substantial extinction of species. And then by 5 and 6 degrees, this is where really mass extinctions and possible human extinction could occur. So in terms of the actual process of extinction, this outlines a healthy ecological pyramid. What you'll notice is that the majority at the bottom are very small creatures or life forms, pollinators, recyclers, things like bacteria, algae, and so on, plants and producers. So we're in the consumer bit at the top, along with the other kind of high apex animals. In essence, what's happening is a death by 1,000 cuts, as it's being described. It's the base that's disappearing. Particularly, we get visible news alerts about the sort of big mammals dying, but actually, what we depend on as not just a human species but many species is what happens at the base of this pyramid. And basically what happens in extinction events is that the base starts to narrow and you get major ecosystem collapse, and it's been described as a flip of the actual triangle that actually causes a mass extinction event. We're already seeing an escalation of biodiversity loss and extinction that's sort of rapidly accelerating since the 1970s. And this is an area that we really need to pay serious attention to. So we can frame this from a public health point of view as describing that the planet is sick. We can think about patient planet coming into our clinic and seeing straight away as medical professionals, health professionals, that the planet is actually undergoing serious multi-system organ failure. And actually, as doctors, we would rush patient planet straight to intensive care for urgent care. And this is something that we should be really thinking about as an analogy about how we're addressing the planetary emergency. We need to take emergency action. And even though it's alarmist, I'd like to also mention that, as medics, we've managed to revive all sorts of people from death's door to a full recovery path. So all hope is not lost, but we do need to act. So this is also within the context, the planetary emergency is also within the context of the other key existential threats and risks that I mentioned earlier. So this is a summary diagram that just really illustrates how what happens with the planet. And say with the pandemic, we saw very clearly how this triggered lots of other events that also created other problems, for example, around peace and security, and destabilized global security and prosperity. So it's really about, we need to pay attention to all of these existential threats and take collaborative action in a strategic and coordinated way if we are to survive as a human species. So I don't want this to all be about doom. We actually need to have a vision for our future, and humans have been immensely creative, and that's how we survived so far. We actually have a hope for the future if we recognize the challenge and if we act collaboratively on this. So in essence, what we're doing with the Interaction Council and One Young World with the Global Youth Security Council is creating a vision and developing a strategy, a plan. So part of this goal is about the prevention, risk reduction and resilience of existential threats. So we plan to be ambitious. We don't want to just reduce the risk of some of these threats. We actually want to prevent them. And actually talking to a public health audience is really key because you're the experts at prevention, the science and art of prevention. And many of these skills can be applied to how we actually prevent the biggest challenges of our lives. So with the Interaction Council then, in terms of strengthening governance, in partnership with One Young World, we've set up the Youth Security Council for Existential Threats, which is co-chairing the first meeting later this year on a global existential security threats board. In essence, this is filling a gap, a global gap in governance, to create an independent governance body that is particularly focused on existential threats and how we can prevent and reduce their risks. And part of the role is coordination and communication and developing a strategic plan or approach to address these threats with the pillars. You'll see very familiar with a public health audience, reaching from across prevention, resilience, preparedness, early alerts and response to recovery, and supported by partners in terms of utilizing the digital transformation to develop One Planet health systems and underpinned by leadership skills for our future. So these recommendations are being currently advanced through Global Youth Security Council for Existential Threats, who I'm working closely with to establish an intergenerational board later this year. And I'm working closely with them as well on developing what's called Strategy X or Strategy Exist. And the rest of the presentation will kind of go through a draft an outline of this, and I'll welcome any further kind of comments, feedback, engagement, and support in this process. Going forward as well, part of to take forward such a strategy, we are launching a global futures platform later this in June, and supported by an advocacy campaign, and engaging future partners as well in developing leadership skills. So a key part of strengthening governance is having a plan, and we desperately need a plan to save humanity, to save the world, you could say. Strategy X or Strategy Exist. At the moment, this is just a two-sided summary, and I'll outline in the next few slides the sort of early development of this plan. And certainly we welcome further feedback and contributions, but the key aspects of this are that it needs to be strategic and it needs to be effective. We need to not waste time on doing things that don't work, and we need to be able to work together to actually scale up and speed up our actions. So this is just the overview, so I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail just so you have the flavour of it. So first of all, with the planet, as you recollect, the key priority here is about preventing tipping points and the escalation of runaway climate change. To do this, we need a planetary emergency response so that we act at speed and scale. This is just an outline in a report recently that sort of highlights some of the digital solutions that can be applied to across the system in terms of an emergency response. And we can apply some of the health thinking, particularly in terms of how we can actually think about the planetary emergency in a systematic way to transform our response. So, for example, we discussed about the need for intensive care for a sick planet, and this can help us to think through, how do we stabilize, for example, homeostasis in terms of temperature and acidosis. We're experts at this in the medical field, and we can apply much of that learning, I think, to the system of the planet's health. In essence, we're all humans and animals that have come from and evolved from the Earth's life system. So there's much in common that we could apply ultimately in terms of how we address the sick planet's health. So, and this again is published in a report on digital solutions, and it outlines some of the common life functions for the vital determinants of life, things like homeostasis, kinetic transfer, toxic clearance, protection and immunity, reproductive diversity, and intelligence and communications. These are all kind of life functions that are in common with virtually all living systems. And if we start breaking down these functions to think about solutions in terms of restabilizing and acting in an emergency way for the planet's health, then this could be really critical. Going forward, I think we also need to have serious discussions about not only increasing nature-based solutions, but also whether it's time to consider the lower risk forms of geoengineering to stop the escalation of tipping points. And then the other aspect of this is a recovery plan, in terms of thinking again about the kind of the essential aspects of life. We all need air, water, land, or a place to live, and food. So for people, then, we've seen that the key risk here to humanity is the threat from future pandemics, especially synthetic or genetically engineered pandemics that could be accidentally released, or intentionally released or weaponized. So we'll just go through some of the solutions here. It's in many respects a lot easier in the health side in terms of addressing the people side, because we actually know what to do. We've already got plenty of tools and frameworks for strengthening health systems. This is a health systems framework that builds on the World Federation of Public Health Associations Global Charter for the Public's Health. It was developed under my leadership in the Commonwealth, and essentially it took a public health approach to how to achieve universal health coverage in a cost-effective way, with a strong public health kind of approach, including health protection and global health security. There's plenty of resources already out there. This isn't the only one, but obviously I'm going to recommend it. So we already know what to do, and this has been used as a framework as well, for identifying existing digital health solutions across the framework. This has been mapped out and collated with the Commonwealth Centre for Digital Health and the Platform for Planet, Place and People. We already have a number of reports and a website which is going to be updated on this. I'll share that later. But going forward, we also need to think about what sort of health system do we need for the future. And we've been very people focused. The pandemic recognized the importance of a One Health approach, combining animal health and human health, and increasingly recognizing the importance of a what I would call a One Planet Health approach, which is also bringing in the environment and the planet's health as well as part of that, as part of the overall health system, applying essentially systems and services that we already have in a multidisciplinary way to create collectively a One Planet health system. And this is something that we could be working for the future, and I think public health partners could really play a key role in driving this forward. So, and then in terms of specifically preventing pandemics, there's a specific report that addresses this. It collates all the existing digital solutions that we can already apply to early detection, alerts, and coordinated action to address pandemics. And realistically, that's the best way that we can do that, is the earliest we can actually prevent it. We can also have good governance on the laboratories and sort of global agreements on laboratories, but there could always be a rogue player who creates a new synthetic pandemic and releases it in a weaponized way. So we need good surveillance detection processes. And one of the things that this particular report also recommends that's a feasible proposal to going forward is developing a global pandemic app that's essentially an adaptable app that could be rapidly changed according to the nature of an infection, that it has a common base across the sort of the fundamental base allows data sharing, anonymous data sharing globally, and allows coordinated and rapid action, and could act in many ways as part of a surveillance tool as well, so that we can really take action where as and where an early pandemic is unfolding. So what about peace? again, this is an area that we know a lot about. However, we're also still keep getting involved in conflicts and wars. So even though we know a lot about what helps to create peace and to prevent violence, we haven't necessarily brought it into a way that is going to be create meaningful peace for the future. However, what I would say is, as part of the plan for addressing existential threats, this is going to become increasingly important to do, because all of the other threats are going to really create stresses on war and conflict, with mass migration and other emerging factors. This is going to become an increasing problem. And actually, there's a lot that we can do. And these next few slides just outline some of the key things that we could do. Based on evidence already, we know what works in terms of preventing violence and abuse from an interpersonal basis. So this is based on a report that was developed with a WHO collaborating centre on violence. And it basically it's a summary of the evidence base of what works at individual, family, and community level, of which much of this is relevant as well for intercountry and global level. This is a summary of much of what's in the report. In essence, it's a life course perspective on all of the effective interventions that we already know about, and there's probably more here as well, that actually work to prevent violence and abuse. So there's a lot that we can already do, especially at interpersonal and community level. That needs to be a foundation then, in terms of how do we create a culture of peace across our cities and our communities. We need to have peace in our homes and within ourselves to be able to create a culture of peace. And this framework is ultimately about then how you can then create a culture of peace with a systems-based approach, with governance, knowledge, advocacy, and capacity for homes, services, space, and security. And then the other key area is about how do we create pathways to peace? And this is particularly important when we're recovering from conflict or trying to extract ourselves from existing conflicts. We need a way out of that. And actually, we've achieved that on a number of fields historically. So there's a lot to learn. And also going forward, we need to be able to identify early risks for conflicts and intervene early. Basic public health approaches, ultimately building bridges for peace and using diplomacy. You can use health and education and social development as a pathway to peace as well, especially with inter-country initiatives. And a lot of the sort of soft diplomacy and negotiations can go behind the scenes with, for example, former heads of government and political level, to actually avoid conflicts from escalating, or to find a way through a conflict as well, and establish essentially a meaningful pathway to peace. And I'd like to remind everyone, even though it feels that there's no way out of some of the current conflicts that we're experiencing globally, we have in the past managed to find pathways to peace out of the wars from the last century, which were absolutely much more devastating in terms of scale and size. So we do have the ability, and we do have the history and the learning to be able to achieve that, but we need a serious plan that is sustainable and helps to address the pain and hurt and allow a full recovery. So the other key aspect, especially in terms of that sort of builds on all the other areas, but is really critical, especially when you're dealing with existential threats, is about the control of weapons, especially nuclear weapons. We already have in place a number of international agreements on non-nuclear proliferation. These need to be reinforced and emphasized with vigor, and also controls on, chemical weapons and prohibition of biological weapons. All of these international agreements and controls are really critical to continue into the future, especially with the combination of AI and emerging technologies. At global level as well, we still need to really advocate for peace. We need peace and security for everyone to be able to live, and that's a fundamental aspect, I understand, of what this conference is about. The other aspect as well is about having mechanisms that prevent escalation. So aside from diplomacy, there's also kind of some technological kind of aspects in terms of that kind of can help delay actually pressing the button, in essence. So all of these things need to be kind of reinforced and emphasized going forward. So prosperity. So the key challenges here we have are unsustainable growth on our kind of current growth model, and how that's contributed ultimately to the planetary emergency in many respects. And going forward, particularly the digital AI crisis, in terms of, the existential threats that especially artificial general intelligence can present. However, going forward, there are many opportunities ultimately with the digital transformation, and we're actually at a very critical juncture in humanity's existence, whereby we're in a position of a digital revolution, moving from different eras of, from the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, technology, to we're now in the digital revolution, but moving to something in the next 3 to 5 years, a quantum leap is as being described in terms of the next stage in terms of digital technology, that will be very profound. Many risks, but many opportunities. Now, if we really leverage the change and opportunities of this with the renewable energy transition at scale and at speed, shifting away from the fossil fuel era to one where growth is based on renewable and sustainable energy, this could be a real opportunity to create the world that we want into the future. So an important aspect we've mentioned is about governance for artificial intelligence. This is a governance framework it's published on the Interaction Council website that just outlines that we need to minimize the risks and maximize the benefits, increase capacity to actually deal with and understand the risks, and have a global governance mechanism in place. It could be in the form of a UN body, for example, that is monitoring risks and creating standards and overseeing this process. And in terms of taking forward the opportunities, here I present something that's called a Global Futures Platform for Planet, People and Peace. This is actually being taken forward with partners, the Commonwealth Centre for Digital Health, and it basically takes a systems-based approach, so including governance, knowledge, advocacy and capacity to prevent the risks for existential risks for planet, people and peace, and it applies digital solutions to speed and scale up that process. This is the team that we've got from Sri Lanka, from the Commonwealth Centre for Digital Health, working closely with me at the nearby university, and having lots of very great forest walks as well, because that's where I live. But we're launching the new global platform for Planet, People and Peace later in June, which basically collates all of the existing tools across this framework. You'll recognize it builds on the World Federation of Public Health Associations Global Charter for the Public's Health. So it's got great public health origins. And I'd like to thank the World Federation for Public Health as well for hosting this for the conferences this week and keeping the profile on this work. But going forward, it's also identifying gaps and developing proposals for further solutions, and we will welcome other partners to take that forward as well. So in summary then, so putting all this together, what we have is a global existential security threats board that we anticipate being launched later this year with the Interaction Council at their plenary meeting. That will be co-chaired by the Global Youth Security Council for Existential Threats, which is already up and running. We've met, I think, 5 or 6 times, and their first key task is developing Strategy X or Strategy Exist, which in essence is and will be a living plan and a process. It won't be a static document. At the moment, we're having a series of briefings to engage wider partners and experts in further discussion as to what do we actually need, what's our plan to save humanity. This is supported by a global futures platform for Planet, People and Peace, which I've outlined, which is based on knowledge and innovation, digital solutions, and working together, especially with the World Academy of Art and Science, with developing what sort of leadership skills do we actually need for the future, and to develop leadership training programs through the academies, through the global academies, and also then advocating and creating essentially a global campaign to engage wider partners and communities to create the world that we want. So this is the last slide. We'll just open up for any further discussions or comments. Do put your comments in the chat and email me as well if you want any follow-up. So in terms of next steps, we've already outlined the process over this year, sort of building momentum with different partners to take forward these different actions. Ultimately, we need more partners to take this forward and more energy. There's lots of room for everyone to play a significant role, and I invite you to contribute in whichever way that you can. So a big thank you for listening today, and we'll open the floor for discussion. Thank you. So either put your hand up for the chat, or put a question in the chat. I think I'm hoping there's somebody from the World Academy of Art and Science who might be able to contribute as well in terms of discussion.
I can see already 2 questions there at the Q&A,
Oh,
if
right.
you'd like to read them.
Oh, sorry, I can't read. They've not come up on mine. Do you mind reading them? Thank you. Oh, there, it's in a different section. I hadn't seen that. Okay, thank you very much. So we've got the challenges discusser classified under non-traditional security issues. And how should we govern response to these challenges? What role and to what extent are non-state actors important here, or do member states dominate the governance? So yes, that's a really good question. In essence, our current global security infrastructure has not really sufficiently addressed these non-traditional security issues. So the UN Security Council and the UN infrastructure has only in part being able to address many of these security issues. So in essence, what the discussions with the Interaction Council and at the high-level expert group meetings have been very much exploring what do we actually need in the future, and how to actually make that work. We have engaged with different UN partners and with state actors. Everyone's going to need to be part of this. Everyone will need to play a role, but sometimes it needs an independent body or board, which is essentially what we're proposing to get the ball rolling. And in a few years' time, this may be part of the UN. I would anticipate as it becomes more institutionalized. But for the moment, we need to kind of actually create what's actually needed because the world needs it now. And then if there's any other questions, there's another one here on international migration is set to pose a security issue. Yes, I quite agree. And as you saw on the sort of the other drivers, migration is going to kind of really be a disruptor for global peace, and it will be in response to much of what's happening in the planetary emergency. So yes, and given we're not currently able to address this, what should we be doing, and how do we act on that? So, I mean, I would kind of particularly say migration is obviously a security threat, but it's also very much a symptom, and how we need to address that is to actually address the root causes of migration if we want to create greater global security. At the moment, a lot of the migration plans are very much sort of based on nationalist interest, and that's not going to work going forward because the size and scale of migrations will be immense, especially with changes in the planetary emergency. So I think this is an area that will need particular serious focus, especially in terms of how do we create pathways for peace and how do we create a stable world. It will be a combination of all of the actions, I believe, that come out of this strategy X as well, and it needs a particular focus. So thank you. So and then Janica, hi there. And then, are we happy with the statistical figures and strategies running to govern the energy traction and green energy? So I think this is in response to sort of, they're part of the renewable energy transition, is also energy intensive and resource intensive. Nothing's perfect, but at the end of the day, we need to actually work out what approach will work in terms of stabilizing the Earth systems to prevent runaway climate change. So we need to go with our eyes wide open in terms of the facts and the evidence to do least harm. But at the end of the day, we also need to create a stable Earth system for humanity to survive. So are there any other questions? And I just wanted to see in terms of if there's anyone who wants to speak up at all from any of the partners. I hear Gary Jacobs. Hi, Gary. I'll just read out your comment here. Thank you for a superb presentation on such important issues. Please elaborate on the structure in terms of where the authority is to come from and how it will relate to the UN and other structures. What is the plan for building the global support and consensus? And how is this initiative linked with the UN Summit of the Future? So thank you. Very important question as well. So what we have at the moment is a draft terms of reference to invite members for the inaugural board meeting for global security threats to human existence. That will those invites will go to the UN and to other multilateral organizations to help with political engagement, particularly supportive countries that have expressed an interest, i.e. member states will be part of this, as well as former heads of government or groupings of former heads of government. So it's partly putting that structure together in the first board meeting will be kind of key to how we then take it forward, but it won't be closed. So if you're not there on the first meeting, it will be an open process to engage with the UN system and with member states going forward. As I say, this isn't intended to be exclusive. It's intended to create the infrastructure, or the shadow infrastructure maybe, of what's actually needed in the world now. We're not in a perfect situation currently, and we need to, leaders need to step up and demonstrate what's actually needed to get things going, and it will evolve in the future. In terms of the UN Futures Summit as well, we hope to have to launch with One Young World an outline of Strategy X to engage further partners in the process of developing that going forward as well at the UN Future Summit, and to engage partners actively in that process. So happy to talk further with you as well later, Gary. So Gary Jacobs is the president for the World Academy of Art and Science, and a big welcome to you. Thank you. So do we have any other questions, or if I can encourage folk to, if they have any other follow-up, either questions or areas they would like to engage with, do get in touch with me. My email's at the bottom of the slide. And the presentation will be available on video to circulate as well, just to help to stimulate the discussion, in essence, about how do we survive as a human species, how do we reduce and prevent risks to our very existence going forward. And we welcome engagement with partners. Everyone can play a role in this. So a big thank you, everyone, for your time today.